Chapter 1. Andes Civilization Without Words. The Andes rise, not as a backdrop to history, but as its first author. Long before ink, parchment, or alphabet, the mountains dictated grammar through altitude, stone, and silence. To understand Andean civilization is therefore not to search for chronicles, but to read landscapes as archives and practices as sentences. This was a civilization without words, yet not without memory, without writing, yet not without reason, without texts, yet not without theory. From the Pacific coast to the snowbound peaks, the Andean world unfolded vertically rather than horizontally. Unlike river civilizations that stretched along predictable plains, Andean societies developed through what anthropologist John Murrah later termed the vertical archipelago, a system in which communities controlled ecological zones at different elevations to ensure survival. Potatoes in the highlands, maize in temperate valleys, coca in subtropical slope-seach altitude was a chapter, and mobility between them was syntax. The mountain was not an obstacle to overcome, but a structure to inhabit intellectually. This ecological logic shaped not only economy, but ontology. The Andean cosmos was layered. Hanan Pasha, the upper world, K Pasha, the world of the living, and Yuku Pasha, the inner or underworld. These were not abstractions, but lived dimensions, mirrored in peaks, valleys, and caves. Time itself was non-linear. The past Nopa lay ahead, visible and known. The future Kipa was behind, unseen. Such concepts were not written, but enacted in ritual, architecture, and agricultural cycles, synchronized with solstices and shadows. Without writing, the Andes perfected other technologies of knowledge. The quipu, often dismissed as mere accounting devices, were complex knotted cords encoding numerical data, categories, and possibly narrative information. Recent research suggests that color, not direction, and spatial arrangement carried semantic meaning. A quipu was not read aloud, but interpreted, handled, and remembered collectively. Knowledge here was tactile and social, resistant to isolation. Meaning lived in hands as much as in minds. Stone, too, functioned as language. Andean architecture demonstrates a philosophical commitment to precision without ostentation. Walls at sites like Cusco and Ollantaytambo are composed of irregular stones fitted so precisely that no mortar is required, a technique both seismic resistant and symbolic. The absence of excess decoration was not a lack of artistry, but an ethic. Form followed cosmology. Political organization followed similar principles. Authority was not justified through divine scripture, but through reciprocity, Ani, redistribution, Minka, and collective labor, Mitta. Power was demonstrated materially through roads, storehouses, terraces, and care during famine. This ecological intelligence, refined over millennia, allowed dense populations to thrive in what outsiders would later call an inhospitable environment. The absence of writing did not prevent abstraction. On the contrary, Andean societies developed a form of practical philosophy grounded in cycles, symmetry, and balance. Duality, Yanintin, structured thought, male and female, light and dark, dry and wet. Knowledge was not accumulated linearly, but maintained through equilibrium. Progress was not expansion, but continuity. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they brought letters, contracts, and chronicles. Yet they struggled to perceive what already existed. They searched for books and found none. They sought laws and found customs. They demanded confessions and received silences. In their records, the Andes appeared mute. This muteness was mistaken for absence, and absence for inferiority. But civilizations are not defined by the medium of their memory. Writing is one solution, not a universal measure. The Andes remind us that human intelligence can crystallize in knots, stones, terraces, and seasons. That thought can be embodied rather than inscribed. That history can be lived without being written. This chapter, therefore, does not begin with kings or empires, but with an epistemological challenge. To read the Andes is to abandon the expectation of text and to accept other grammars of meaning. Only then can the long arc of Andean civilization, culminating but not originating with the Inca, be understood not as a prelude to conquest, but as a complete and coherent world on its own terms. The mountains did not speak in letters, they spoke in form, rhythm, and survival. And for thousands of years, people listened. Chapter 2. ANDES, Memory Without Writing. Memory, in the Andes, was not an archive preserved against time. It was a process enacted through time. To remember was not to read, but to participate. In literate civilizations, writing stabilizes memory by fixing it. In the Andes, stability emerged through redundancy and ritual. To live within the community was to carry memory as a social duty. At the center of this system stood the quipu. Far from a primitive substitute for writing, the quipu represented an alternative epistemology. Numerical precision coexisted with categorical abstraction. Census data, tribute obligations, labor rotations, and storehouse inventories were encoded in knots of varying types, distances, and orientations. But quipus were never autonomous objects. They required trained interpreters, quipucomiokes, whose authority derived from embodied expertise rather than textual reference. Memory, therefore, remained human-centered, not object-centered. This dependence on interpreters reveals a critical distinction. Andean knowledge resisted detachment. One could not simply consult a quipu as one consults a book. Knowledge demanded presence, explanation, and context. It lived within networks of trust. This made Andean memory resilient internally, yet vulnerable to external disruption. When Spanish authorities executed or displaced Quipucamayak's, entire systems of meaning collapsed, not because they were fragile, but because they were relational. Architecture functioned as another mnemonic system. Sacred landscapes, wakas marked mythic events, ancestral origins, and cosmic alignments. Pilgrimage routes connected these sites, transforming geography into narrative. To move through space was to traverse memory. Cities such as Cusco were themselves diagrams. The city plan mirrored the body of a puma, embedding cosmology into urban form. Memory here was not recalled, it was inhabited. Time, too, structured remembrance differently. Andean societies did not conceive of a sharp rupture between mythic time and historical time. Founding ancestors were not distant figures relegated to legend, but ongoing presences accessed through ritual. The dead were not sealed away, but maintained relationships with the living. Ancestor mummies, malquis, were consulted in political decisions, fed symbolically, and paraded during festivals. Memory thus crossed biological boundaries. The past remained active. This continuity complicates modern distinctions between history and myth. For the Andes, myth was not falsehood, but framework. It organized moral order, environmental responsibility, and political legitimacy. When an Inca ruler claimed descent from the sun, this was not mere propaganda. It was a cosmological assertion, situating authority within universal balance. Memory justified power not through documents, but through alignment with cosmic principles visible to all. Textiles constituted yet another archive. Andean weaving encoded information through color schemes, patterns, and materials. Certain designs were restricted to specific ethnic groups or ranks. To miswear a textile was to misstate identity. Cloth, unlike paper, endured through movement, labor, and climate. It aged with its wearer, accumulating biography. In this sense, memory was not static preservation, but lived accumulation. Crucially, Andean memory was collective rather than individual. Personal achievement mattered less than communal continuity. Names repeated across generations. Roles persisted even as people changed. What endured was not the individual voice, but the pattern. This stood in sharp contrast to European traditions that privileged authorship, originality, and linear chronology. When Spaniards demanded written histories, Andean elites struggled not because they lacked history, but because the question itself was misaligned. Colonial chroniclers frequently accused the Andes of forgetfulness, citing contradictory oral accounts as evidence of unreliability. This critique misunderstands the function of variation. In Andean systems, multiplicity did not invalidate truth. It expressed perspective. Different versions of origin myths could coexist without conflict because they addressed different relational contexts. Consistency was less important than coherence within lived reality. The destruction of Andean memory systems under colonial rule was therefore epistemic as much as political. Writing was imposed not merely as a tool of administration, but as a criterion of legitimacy. What could not be written was dismissed. Quipus were burned, rituals suppressed, landscapes renamed. Memory was forcibly externalized into colonial archives that stripped it of context. What survived often did so in fragmentary form, misunderstood through foreign categories. Yet, Andean memory did not disappear. It adapted. Oral traditions absorbed new elements. Festivals incorporated Christian symbols without abandoning older rhythms. Indigenous languages encoded histories absent from official records. Even today, agricultural practices preserve knowledge older than empires. Memory persists where writing failed to replace it. This chapter then reframes memory not as storage, but as structure. The Andes demonstrate that civilization does not require writing to remember, only commitment to repetition, community, and place. Memory was not frozen in text, but renewed through life itself. The cost of this system was vulnerability to violent disruption. Its strength was depth of integration. To understand the Andes is to accept that memory can be embodied rather than recorded, performed rather than read, and shared rather than owned. Civilization here was not written down. It was carried forward, step by step, season by season, generation by generation, without ever needing to be spelled out. Chapter 3, ANDES, Order without law. To speak of order in the Andes is to abandon the familiar image of law as text. There were no written codes, no constitutions carved in stone, no decrees preserved on parchment. Yet Andean society sustained one of the most stable and extensive political systems of the pre-modern world. Order existed not because rules were written, but because relationships were structured. Law in the Andes was not a document, it was a practice. The foundation of Andean order lay in reciprocity. The principle of mutual aid governed daily life. A household helped another build a house. The favor would be returned when needed. This was not charity, nor was it contractual exchange. It was obligation embedded in belonging. To refuse any was not merely impolite, it was antisocial, a violation of one's place within the moral economy. Sanction operated through reputation and exclusion rather than punishment. Order was therefore transactional, but not monetized, compulsory, but not alienating. This system functioned because authority was visible and material. The state did not govern through abstract laws, but through infrastructure. Roads connected distant regions. Storehouses, kulkas, lined mountain passes. Way stations, tambos, fed travelers and messengers. Failure manifested through famine, disaster, or social unrest undermined legitimacy. There was no legal immunity from cosmic judgment. Crime, as understood in modern legal systems, occupied a marginal role. Spatial organization reinforced this moral order. Settlements were planned to reflect social structure, with communal spaces prioritizing collective activity. There was little architectural emphasis on private grandeur. Even elite residences differed more in scale than in symbolic separation. This spatial continuity reduced the psychological distance between rulers and ruled. Order was maintained through proximity and visibility. Chapter 4, ANDES, Economy Without Money to Speak of. An Andean economy is to discard the assumption that exchange requires currency. There were no coins, no markets governed by price signals, no accumulation of capital measured in abstract units. Yet the Andean world sustained dense populations, monumental construction, and imperial integration across thousands of kilometers. This was an economy without money, but not without calculation, incentive, or efficiency. Value existed, though it was not denominated. At the foundation of this system stood labor, not currency. Work was the primary medium of exchange, embedded within social obligation. The same principles that structured Order Inca and also organized production and distribution. One did not purchase food, shelter, or security. One earned them through participation. Economic life was therefore inseparable from social life. To be excluded from labor was to be excluded from survival. Agriculture formed the core of Andean production, but it was agriculture of exceptional sophistication. This flexibility reduced rebellion and minimized administrative cost. Power was maintained through incorporation, not perpetual violence. Central to this model was the absence of private land ownership. Land belonged to the community, the ancestors, and the state in shared proportion. Each Elu cultivated parcels, allocated according to household size and need. The state claimed labor, not land. This distinction prevented the emergence of a landed aristocracy whose interests might diverge from collective stability. Power flowed vertically through labor obligation rather than horizontally through property accumulation. Administrative integration relied on infrastructure rather than garrisons. Roads, bridges, and storehouses bound regions together materially. Messengers chasqui transmitted information rapidly across vast distances, enabling coordination without permanent military presence. The state did not need to occupy territory continuously. It needed to remain reachable. Power was logistical before it was coercive. Cultural integration followed similar logic. The Inca promoted a shared ritual calendar, standardized administrative language, Quechua, and state-sponsored festivals. Accustomed to empires defined by borders, laws, and tribute extracted in money, they perceived Andean authority as fragile and incomplete. Chapter 7. ANDES. Knowledge without schools. Knowledge in the Andes was not centralized in institutions, codified in curricula, or transmitted through formal instruction. There were no schools in the conventional sense, no classrooms, no written examinations. Yet, Andean societies cultivated an extraordinarily deep and adaptive knowledge base, ecological, astronomical, medical, and social, sufficient to sustain complex civilization across extreme environments. This was knowledge without schools, but not without structure, rigor, or continuity. Learning began not in abstraction, but in participation. Children acquired knowledge by doing, observing, and repeating. Agricultural skills were learned in fields, weaving techniques at the loom, ritual practices in festivals, social norms through communal labor. Instruction was embedded in daily life. The boundary between learning and living did not exist. Knowledge was not separated from function. It was inseparable from survival. This mode of transmission privileged embodiment over explanation. Skills were mastered through muscle memory and sensory attunement. A farmer learned to read soil moisture by touch, to anticipate frost by wind and cloud, to sense seasonal shifts through animal behavior. Such knowledge resisted verbalization, but excelled in precision. It was situational, adaptive, and immediately actionable. Astronomical knowledge illustrates this clearly. Andean societies tracked celestial movements with remarkable accuracy, aligning temples, windows, and stone pillars to solstices, equinoxes, and lunar cycles. Yet this astronomy was not taught as theory. It was encoded architecturally and ritually. Priests and specialists learned to read shadows and stars through repeated observation across years. Knowledge persisted because the sky itself remained the textbook. Calendrical systems followed similar logic. Agricultural cycles depended on precise timing. Planting too early or too late could mean catastrophe. Rather than relying on written calendars, communities synchronized activity through ritual markers, horizon observations, and environmental cues. Time was learned collectively. Everyone knew when to act because everyone participated in the same rhythms. Specialized knowledge did exist, but it was not monopolized by closed institutions. Healers, astronomers, architects, and administrators emerged through apprenticeship rather than certification. Expertise was recognized socially, not credentialed formally. A Hampock healer earned authority through efficacy, a quipus through accuracy, a master weaver through complexity of design. Failure eroded trust. Competence sustained it. Crucially, Andean knowledge systems emphasized redundancy rather than exclusivity. Multiple individuals often held overlapping skills. This reduced vulnerability to loss. When a specialist died, knowledge did not vanish entirely. It survived in fragments distributed across the community. Schools, by contrast, concentrate expertise. The Andes dispersed it. Moral and social knowledge followed the same pattern. Ethics were not taught through doctrine, but through participation in Inca and ritual obligation. Children learned fairness by sharing labor, patience by waiting for collective outcomes, and responsibility by seeing consequences unfold socially. Discipline was corrective rather than punitive. Learning was continuous, not age. Memory functioned as curriculum. Stories, myths, and origin narratives encoded environmental lessons, social expectations, and historical memory. These narratives were not fixed texts, but adaptable frameworks. Elders adjusted emphasis depending on context, famine, abundance, conflict, or peace. Knowledge evolved without being formalized. Flexibility was a feature, not a flaw. The absence of schools also meant the absence of intellectual hierarchy divorced from labor. There was no class of scholars exempt from production. This integration grounded theory in reality and prevented abstraction from drifting into irrelevance. Colonial observers misinterpreted this system as ignorance. Searching for schools, they found none. Seeking books, they encountered silence. They concluded that Andean societies lacked education. In response, colonial authorities imposed schools designed to teach literacy, doctrine, and obedience. These institutions did not supplement indigenous knowledge, they displaced it. The consequences were profound. Knowledge that had been adaptive and local became abstract and hierarchical. Children were separated from productive life. Oral traditions were devalued. Skills that required long-term apprenticeship declined. What was gained in literacy was often lost in ecological intelligence. Education became a tool of assimilation rather than continuity. Yet, Andean knowledge systems did not disappear. They persisted informally in farming practices, herbal medicine, weather prediction, and ritual timing. Even today, indigenous communities preserve knowledge inaccessible to formal schooling. Climate resilience, biodiversity management, and sustainable agriculture increasingly draw upon practices refined without classrooms. This chapter challenges the assumption that schools are prerequisites for civilization. Schools are one method of knowledge transmission, not its origin. They excel at standardization, but struggle with context. The Andes demonstrate an alternative, a civilization that educated through immersion, repetition, and responsibility. Knowledge here was not accumulated to dominate nature, but to coexist with it. Learning aimed not at mastery, but at alignment. The measure of intelligence was not theoretical elegance, but practical endurance across generations. In the Andes, one did not graduate, one became competent. One did not study life, one entered it. Knowledge was not separated from existence. It was the means by which existence continued. Chapter 8: Andes Religion Without Scripture. Religion in the Andes did not rest upon revelation fixed in text. There were no sacred books, no canonical doctrines, no prophets whose words defined orthodoxy for all time. Yet, Andean religious life permeated every dimension of existence: agriculture, politics, knowledge, and memory. This was religion without scripture, but not without metaphysics, ritual, discipline, or moral force. Belief was not something read or recited. It was something practiced, inhabited, and sustained through relationship. At its core, Andean religion was not centered on belief as assent to propositions. It was centered on relation. Humans existed within a living cosmos, populated by beings with agency: mountains, apis, springs, rocks, ancestors, celestial bodies, animals, and forces not reducible to metaphor. These entities were not symbols pointing elsewhere. They were present actors in the world. Religion was therefore not a system of explanations, but a framework of obligation. The sacred was not separated from the everyday. There was no sharp boundary between ritual time and ordinary time. Farming itself was a religious act, requiring offerings before planting and gratitude after harvest. Travel invoked protection rituals. Construction demanded consultation with the land. Illness called for negotiation with unseen forces. Religion was continuous rather than episodic. One did not enter the sacred, one lived within it. Without scripture, authority derived from continuity rather than interpretation. There was no fixed text to debate, revise, or reform. Instead, legitimacy came from ancestral precedent and demonstrated efficacy. A ritual mattered because it had worked before, because rains followed, crops grew, illness subsided. Religious knowledge was empirical in a non-modern sense, validated through repetition and outcome, not through doctrine. Central to Andean religion was the concept of reciprocity, extended beyond human society. Humans owed labor, offerings, and respect to non-human beings, just as they did to neighbors. Failure to reciprocate risked imbalance, drought, disease, misfortune. Morality was therefore ecological. Sin was not disobedience to law, but neglect of relationship. Redemption was not confession, but restoration of balance. The sun, Inti, occupied a prominent position, particularly under Inca state religion, but it was never exclusive. Solar worship did not eliminate other deities. It organized them hierarchically. Local wakas retained power and personality. Mountains commanded loyalty stronger than distant imperial cults. Religion remained pluralistic, grounded in place. There was no impulse toward universal conversion because belief was inseparable from landscape. Ritual specialists mediated these relationships. Priests, diviners, and healers did not preach doctrine. They interpreted signs, cracks in bones, patterns in leaves, dreams, whether anomalies all were read as communications. Interpretation required long apprenticeship and communal trust. Authority was situational, not absolute. A ritual specialist succeeded only as long as outcomes sustained confidence. Sacrifice, often sensationalized by outsiders, must be understood within this relational framework. Offerings of food, textiles, animals, and occasionally humans were not acts of cruelty for spectacle, but transactions within a moral economy. The value of a sacrifice lay not in suffering, but in significance. The most costly offerings were made during moments of extreme imbalance, drought, political crisis, cosmic transition. The act acknowledged dependence rather than dominance. Ancestor veneration further blurred religious categories. The dead were not removed from society. They remained participants. Mummies were consulted, celebrated, and integrated into festivals. Ancestors embodied continuity between past and present, grounding religion in lineage rather than transcendence. Salvation was not located in an afterlife detached from this world, but in maintaining harmony across generations. Without scripture, religious change occurred gradually. Innovations were absorbed through practice, not proclamation. When the Inca elevated the sun cult, they did so by layering it over existing beliefs, not by erasing them. This adaptive capacity allowed Andean religion to integrate diversity without sexism. Orthodoxy was unnecessary because heterogeneity was expected. Spanish missionaries profoundly misunderstood this system. Searching for doctrine, they found ritual. Seeking belief statements, they encountered practice. Text replaced landscape as authority. Confession replaced restitution. Sin became internal rather than relational. Yet Andean religion did not vanish. It adapted, embedding older relationships within new forms. Saints took on characteristics of wakas. Festivals synchronized with agricultural cycles. Churches were built atop sacred sites. Syncretism was not confusion, it was continuity under constraint. Religion in the Andes was not about explaining the universe. It was about living responsibly within it. The absence of scripture did not signal spiritual poverty. It signaled a different orientation, one in which the sacred was not spoken but encountered, not believed but maintained. Civilization here did not read its gods. It worked with them, fed them, remembered them, and negotiated with them daily. The Andes remind us that religion can exist without books, without dogma, and without final answers, rooted instead in the ongoing task of keeping the world in balance. Chapter 9, ANDES, Time Without History. Time in the Andes did not unfold as a straight line progressing from origin to end. There were no chronicles advancing year by year, no annals separating past from present with rigid boundaries. Yet Andean societies possessed a deep and sophisticated sense of temporality, one capable of sustaining memory, authority, and continuity across centuries. This was time without history, but not without structure, causality, or meaning. Western historical consciousness is anchored in linear sequence. Events follow one another irreversibly. The past recedes, the future approaches. In the Andes, time was conceived relationally rather than sequentially. The Quechua language itself encodes this difference. The past nopa lies in front visible, known, while the future quipa lies behind, unseen. One walks backward into tomorrow, guided by what has already been experienced. This inversion reveals a fundamental philosophical stance. The past was not dead or completed. It was active reference. Decisions were justified by precedent, not projection. To act responsibly was to align oneself with ancestral patterns that had already proven effective. Innovation existed, but it was conservative, by design incremental, contextual, and reversible. Without written history, continuity was preserved through cyclical repetition. Agricultural seasons, ritual calendars, and political ceremonies reenacted foundational moments again and again. Each repetition did not merely commemorate the past, it renewed it. Time functioned as a spiral rather than a circle, returning to familiar points, but never in exactly the same conditions. Founding myths exemplify this logic. Origin stories were not treated as distant events locked in mythic time. They were ongoing realities. Sacred ancestors were believed to continue influencing the present, inhabiting mountains, stones, and lineages. The past was spatialized rather than temporalized. One could encounter it by traveling to a place, performing a ritual, or consulting an ancestor. Political authority relied on this temporal structure. Inca rulers did not claim legitimacy through progressive reform or future promise. They ruled by positioning themselves within an ancestral continuum. Each new reign was understood as a rebalancing rather than a new beginning. The absence of written dynastic history did not weaken legitimacy. It anchored it more firmly in lived memory. Even death did not mark a final temporal rupture. Ancestors remained present participants in social and political life. The boundary between past and present was permeable. Time expanded outward rather than moving forward. This temporal worldview shaped Andean attitudes toward change. Catastrophe was not interpreted as rupture, but as imbalance. Droughts, earthquakes, and social upheavals signaled misalignment between human action and cosmic order. Restoration required correction, not reinvention. The future was not to be engineered, it was to be stabilized. The absence of historical narrative did not imply ignorance of sequence. Andean societies distinguished before and after, cause and consequence. But they did not isolate events into abstract timelines. Meaning resided in pattern rather than chronology. What mattered was not when something happened, but how it fit within enduring cycles of reciprocity and balance. Spanish chroniclers misinterpreted this temporal logic profoundly. They asked for dates, reign lengths, and linear successions. Andean informants responded with relational accounts: who followed whom, who displaced whom, which rituals changed. These answers were dismissed as confusion or contradiction. In reality, they reflected a different ordering principle. Colonial rule imposed linear time through calendars, contracts, and Christian eschatology. History was reframed as a path from pagan darkness toward Christian salvation. Indigenous temporalities were delegitimized as backward-looking or stagnant. Progress became a moral imperative rather than a contextual judgment. This imposition had destabilizing effects. Linear time privileges rupture. Conquest becomes a turning point. Colonization, a new era. Andean time resisted such segmentation. The colonial demand to abandon the past in favor of a promised future clashed with a worldview in which the past was the primary source of orientation. Dispossession followed not only materially, but temporally. Yet, Andean temporal consciousness did not disappear. Agricultural rituals continued to mark seasonal cycles. Festivals blended Christian saints with older cosmological rhythms. Oral histories preserved memory without fixing it to dates. Even today, many Andean communities relate to time through agricultural and ritual calendars rather than abstract chronology. This persistence challenges the assumption that history, as written narrative, is the only legitimate form of temporal knowledge. History excels at recording events. It struggles with continuity. The Andes preserved continuity precisely because they did not fragment time into documents. Memory remained integrated with land, labor, and ritual. Time without history was not timelessness. It was attentiveness to recurrence, consequence, and balance. The future was approached cautiously, guided by accumulated experience rather than speculative ambition. Stability mattered more than novelty. Survival across extreme environments demanded nothing less. This chapter reframes temporality itself as a civilizational choice. The Andes did not lack history. They rejected a particular way of organizing it. Their time was not written because it did not need to be externalized. It was lived, rehearsed, and remembered through action. Civilization here did not move forward by forgetting. It endured by remembering again and again what had already worked. In a world increasingly obsessed with acceleration and rupture, the Andean conception of time stands as a radical alternative, one in which the past remains visible, the present remains responsible, and the future remains deliberately unknown. Chapter 10, ANDES, Collapse without end. Collapse is usually imagined as an ending, a final chapter marked by defeat, disappearance, or silence. In the Andes, collapse followed a different logic. The arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century shattered political coordination, decimated populations, and dismantled institutions. This was collapse without end, disintegration without extinction, rupture without erasure. And the embodied authority of the Sapa Inca was eliminated. Smallpox killed rulers before steel ever reached Cusco. Coordination failed not because it was weak, but because it was relational. Once key nodes were removed, the network dissolved. This assumption reveals a bias toward centralized institutions as the sole carriers of culture. In the Andes, however, the state was a layer, not the foundation. When it collapsed, deeper structures persisted. The most enduring of these structures was the kinship, land stewardship, and reciprocal labor continued even as colonial authorities attempted to dismantle them. Communities adapted obligations to new conditions, sometimes complying superficially while preserving internal norms. Labor drafts were reinterpreted, rituals went underground, memory shifted from public ceremony to domestic practice. Collapse forced compression, not disappearance. Colonial rule introduced new forms of domination, property regimes, monetary taxation, forced labor in mines. These systems were extractive rather than redistributive. They demanded compliance without reciprocity. Yet even within these constraints, Andean practices reshaped imposed structures. Wage labor coexisted with communal farming. Christian festivals synchronized with agricultural cycles. Saints absorbed the personalities of older wakas. Survival depended on translation rather than resistance alone. What collapsed most thoroughly was the Andean epistemology in the eyes of the colonizers. Writing became the sole recognized medium of truth. Knowledge that could not be documented was dismissed. Quipus were destroyed. Oral authorities marginalized. Landscapes desacralized through renaming. This epistemic violence was as devastating as physical conquest. It severed the visible continuity of Andean thought. Yet, invisibility is not absence. Practices that could not be written survived precisely because they were embodied. Farming techniques adapted to altitude. Seed diversity persisted. Medicinal knowledge passed quietly across generations. The mountains continued to teach. Collapse revealed a paradox. Systems optimized for documentation failed to perceive what could not be archived. Resistance took many forms. Some were overt rebellions, messianic movements, refusals to pay tribute. Others were subtle, selective forgetting, syncretism, strategic compliance. The Andes did not oppose colonial power with an alternative state. They undermined it with continuity. What could not be governed could not be fully destroyed. Time again played a crucial role. Colonial narratives framed conquest as a decisive break before and after. Andean temporal logic absorbed conquest as catastrophe within a longer cycle. Suffering was real, but not final. Memory extended beyond trauma, refusing to grant the conqueror the authority to define the end of history. Collapse became one more imbalance to be endured and corrected where possible. Modernity intensified this dynamic. Nation-states inherited colonial frameworks, continuing to marginalize indigenous life worlds in the name of progress. Schools replaced apprenticeship. Markets displaced reciprocity. Archives supplanted memory. Yet Andean civilization continued to exist in partial forms, often labeled tradition or folklore to deny its contemporaneity. Survival required invisibility. The concept of collapse itself demands reevaluation. If collapse means the loss of centralized coordination, then the Andes collapsed. If it means the disappearance of a civilization's logic, then it did not. The core principles, reciprocity, balance, relationality, ecological intelligence, persisted without state support. Collapse stripped away scale, not substance. This endurance exposes a limitation in historical analysis. Civilizations are often measured by monuments and texts, which are easiest to destroy and hardest to regenerate. Practices embedded in daily life are more resilient. They do not announce themselves, they endure quietly. The Andes exemplify this asymmetry. In recent decades, Andean knowledge has reemerged not as nostalgia, but as necessity. Climate instability has renewed interest in terrace agriculture, seed diversity, and water management. Community-based governance offers alternatives to centralized failure. What once appeared as remnants now appear as resources. Collapse, in retrospect, preserved possibilities by preventing total assimilation. This chapter, therefore, reframes collapse as transformation under constraint. The Andes did not end. They contracted, adapted, and waited. Civilization without writing, law, money, iron, schools, scripture, and linear history proved capable of surviving conquest because it was never dependent on a single structure. Its intelligence was distributed. Collapse without end challenges the narrative comfort of finality. It refuses the idea that conquest closes chapters. The Andes teach that civilizations can persist without recognition, coherence without visibility, continuity without power. Endurance does not require triumph. It requires memory enacted through life. What fell was an empire. What remained was a way of being in the world. And that way quiet, relational, and resilient outlasted the conquerors who believed they had written the final line. Chapter 11. Andes Survival. Without recognition, survival is often mistaken for victory, and disappearance mistaken for defeat. The Andes fit neither category neatly. After collapse, after conquest, after centuries of marginalization, Andean civilization persisted, but largely without recognition. It survived not as a celebrated continuity, but as an unacknowledged presence embedded in labor, landscape, and habit. This was survival without recognition, endurance that did not require validation, continuity that did not announce itself. Colonial and later republican regimes did not seek the total annihilation of Andean life worlds. That would have been impossible. Instead, they sought invisibility. Indigenous practices were tolerated only when stripped of authority and reframed as backward custom, folklore, or rural habit. Civilization was redefined as literacy, urbanity, and participation in the market. Everything else was reclassified as residue. This reclassification was devastating precisely because it was subtle. To survive, Andean practices had to present themselves as non-threatening. Reciprocity became help, ritual became festival, cosmology became belief, knowledge became tradition. These translations allowed continuity, but at the cost of legitimacy. What survived did so in fragments, disconnected from the civilizational logic that had once unified them. Land remained the primary site of endurance. Agricultural terraces continued to shape slopes long after their builders were forgotten by official history. Seed diversity persisted through careful selection rather than scientific preservation. Farmers maintained ecological intelligence, not because it was valued, but because it worked. Survival here was pragmatic, not ideological. Language functioned as another vessel. Quechua and Aymara encoded relational concepts that resisted translation, reciprocity, balance, collective identity. Even when suppressed, these languages carried memory within grammar itself. To speak them was to inhabit a worldview incompatible with strict individualism. Language survived because daily life required it. Social organization adapted quietly. The Ilu did not disappear, it transformed. Communal labor persisted under new names and constraints. Decision-making shifted from ritual authority to pragmatic consensus. Collective responsibility survived beneath imposed legal frameworks. These structures rarely appeared in archives, making them easy to ignore and hard to eradicate. Religion exemplified this survival strategy. Andean cosmology did not confront Christianity directly. It merged, layered, and concealed itself. Mountains became saints. Ancestors hid behind altars. Rituals followed Christian calendars while preserving older rhythms. Outsiders saw conversion. Andean communities experienced continuity. Survival depended on opacity. Recognition, when it came, was often partial and instrumental. Anthropologists documented indigenous culture as an object of study. States celebrated heritage while undermining living communities. Tourism aestheticized ruins while ignoring descendants. Recognition without power proved hollow. Survival continued regardless. The modern nation-state intensified this contradiction. Indigenous identity was acknowledged symbolically, but constrained politically. Economic development prioritized extraction over balance. Education standardized knowledge while devaluing local expertise. Survival required constant negotiation, participation without assimilation, visibility without surrender. Yet survival without recognition produced a particular strength. Unseen systems avoid direct attack. Practices transmitted through habit rather than proclamation are harder to legislate away. Andean civilization, no longer centralized or explicit, became diffuse. It existed wherever people planted, shared labor, remembered ancestors, and read the land. This endurance challenges dominant measures of civilizational success. Visibility, expansion, and influence are fragile. Quiet continuity is not. The Andes did not survive by winning history's attention. They survived by refusing to depend on it. Only recently has recognition begun to shift not as benevolence, but necessity. Climate instability, ecological collapse, and social fragmentation have exposed the limits of dominant models. Practices long dismissed as primitive now appear adaptive. Recognition arrives late, and often selectively, but it no longer controls survival. The Andes endured without it. This chapter reframes survival as a form of agency. To persist without acknowledgement is not passivity, it is strategic restraint. Andean civilization chose continuity over confrontation, adaptation over assertion. Its survival was not heroic in narrative terms, but profound in consequence. Civilizations that require recognition to exist are vulnerable to forgetting. The Andes did not make that mistake. They embedded themselves in life itself, hard to see, harder to erase. Chapter 12, ANDES, Civilization Beyond the Archive. Civilization is usually measured by what it leaves behind: texts, monuments, laws, and institutions legible to power. By these standards, the Andes appear incomplete, impressive in ruins, elusive in continuity. Yet this judgment reveals more about the archive than about civilization itself. The Andean world forces a final reconsideration. What if civilization is not something preserved in records, but something sustained in relations? What if endurance, rather than inscription, is the deeper measure of historical intelligence? The Andean case exposes the limits of archival civilization. Writing fixes meaning, but it also freezes it. Archives privilege central authority, linear time, and explicit declaration. The Andes developed along a different axis. Knowledge moved through bodies, landscapes, and repeated action. Memory lived in labor rhythms, ritual calendars, and ecological calibration. Meaning was not stored, it was enacted. This form of civilization is difficult for empires and later nation-states to recognize because it resists extraction. There is no single text to confiscate, no doctrine to outlaw, no capital to seize. Andean order was distributed. Its coherence emerged from interdependence rather than command. Power flowed horizontally through obligation and vertically through cosmology, but never concentrated long enough to become detachable. The absence of writing did not mean the absence of history. It meant history was not externalized. The past was not something one consulted. It was something one repeated with variation. Agricultural cycles reenacted ancestral decisions. Place names preserved events. Oral narratives encoded ethical lessons rather than chronological fact. Time was recursive, not cumulative. Modernity struggled to classify this. Colonial administrators dismissed it as prehistory. Enlightenment thinkers labeled it incomplete development. Even sympathetic observers often reduced Andean civilization to technical achievement: terraces, roads, stonework, while overlooking the philosophical substrate that made those achievements possible. Material remains were legible. Relational intelligence was not. Yet it is precisely this relational intelligence that now appears prescient. The Andean worldview assumed limits. It treated the environment not as resource, but as partner. It valued balance over growth, sufficiency over accumulation, continuity over novelty. These were not moral preferences, but survival strategies calibrated to extreme geography. Civilization was an adaptive system, not an expansionist project. The collapse under colonialism did not invalidate this model. it interrupted it. What followed was not replacement, but layering. Andean logic persisted beneath imported institutions, often in tension, sometimes in accommodation. The result was not hybridity in the celebratory sense, but asymmetry, one system visible and dominant, the other submerged and enduring. In the 21st century, this asymmetry is beginning to invert in subtle ways. Climate instability has undermined confidence in extractive rationality. Social fragmentation has exposed the costs of radical individualism. Development models premised on infinite growth have reached ecological and moral limits. Under these conditions, Andean principles, reciprocity, restraint, collective responsibility, enter discourse, not as nostalgia, but as necessity. This belated recognition, however, risks repeating old patterns. When Andean knowledge is abstracted into policy language or sustainability rhetoric, it is again detached from its living context. Civilization beyond the archive resists such translation. Its intelligence cannot be reduced to principles without losing its grounding in practice. It survives best when lived, not cited. The Andes thus offer a final provocation. Civilization does not require permanence to matter. It does not need to conquer, expand, or dominate to endure. It can choose to remain small, local, and adaptive and still shape history, quietly but persistently. Its influence may not appear in textbooks, but it manifests in survival itself. This reframes historical judgment. Instead of asking which civilizations won, we might ask which ones lasted without destroying their conditions of existence. Instead of privileging visibility, we might attend to resilience. By these measures, the Andes emerge not as an exception, but as a countermodel one that challenges the archive-centered imagination of history. Civilization without words was never civilization without thought. It was thought distributed across land, labor, and time. Civilization without empire was not weakness, but refusal. Civilization without recognition was not absence, but patience. The Andes did not write themselves into history. They embedded themselves into the world, and they are still there. Final ending. A civilization that refused to end the story of the Andes does not close with a fall, a conquest, or a date. It closes with continuity. What appears from the outside as silence is in fact persistence without spectacle. The Andes endured by refusing the terms through which history usually declares victory or defeat. They did not outright their conquerors, outbuild them, or outshout them. They outlasted them by embedding meaning in land, obligation, and restraint rather than in records or empires. This is not a civilization preserved in ruins, but one carried forward in ways of living that adapt without dissolving. Its ending, therefore, is not an ending at all, but a reminder. Some civilizations do not conclude. They remain quietly shaping the future, precisely because they never needed to announce themselves as the past.